The morning sun had barely touched the tops of the courthouse steps when Lynn arrived, clutching her worn leather briefcase with white knuckles. She paused at the bottom of the grand staircase, taking in the massive columns and gleaming windows that seemed to stare down at her with judgment. This was her first time at the downtown courthouse, a world away from the small claims court where she usually helped her neighbors with minor disputes. Lynn checked her watch, a simple timepiece that had belonged to her late husband. She was an hour early, but nervousness had pushed her out of her small apartment before dawn. Better to be early than to give anyone a reason to look down on her more than they already would. At 42, Lynn wasn't what most people pictured when they thought of a lawyer, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had run a small grocery store until their deaths 3 years ago. She had worked her way through night school, earning her law degree while raising her daughter alone. Her simple navy suit had been bought, secondhand and carefully tailored at home. Her shoes, though polished to a shine, showed the small cracks of age that no amount of care could hide. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, adjusting the collar of her blouse. For Mr. Zhang. Mr. Zhang was her elderly neighbor, a kind man who had helped watch her daughter years ago when Lynn was rushing between work and classes. Now he was about to lose the home he'd lived in for 30 years to a powerful real estate company that claimed his property was violating obscure zoning laws that hadn't been enforced until the neighborhood became valuable to developers. Kaiter had spent weeks preparing for this hearing. Her small dining table had disappeared under stacks of legal documents, precedent cases, and property laws. She'd barely slept, but she felt ready. The law was on their side if only she could make the judge see it. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the steps and made her way through security, following the signs to courtroom 7. The hallways grew more intimidating with each step. Polished marble floors, portraits of stern-faced judges, hushed conversations between lawyers in suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She found a bench outside the courtroom and sat down, going through her notes one more time. Gradually, the hallway filled with people. The lawyers for West Ridge Development arrived in a group, 3 men and a woman, all wearing perfectly tailored suits, all carrying sleek leather briefcases, all exuding the confidence that came from knowing they belonged in these halls of power. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, glanced at Lynn and then turned to his colleagues with a smirk. She couldn't hear what he said, but the chuckles that followed made her cheeks burn. She kept her eyes on her papers. At precisely 9:30, the doors to courtroom 7 opened. Lynn waited for the others to enter first, then slipped in behind them. The courtroom was even more impressive than she had imagined. High ceilings, wood paneling, and an imposing bench where the judge would sit. Mr. Zhang was already there, looking small and frightened in his best shirt, which was at least 20 years old. Lynn hurried over to him, touching his arm gently. "It's going to be okay," she assured him, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. "Thank you for doing this," he said in a low voice. No one else would help. Before she could respond, a side door opened and a court officer called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Preston." The judge swept in, his black robes flowing behind him. He was younger than Lynn had expected, maybe in his early 50s, with a sharp gaze that took in the courtroom at a glance. His eyes lingered briefly on Lynn and Mr. Zhang before he took his seat. "Be seated," he said, his voice filling the room without effort. He shuffled through some papers, then looked up. "West Ridge Development versus Zhang. I understand this is a zoning dispute." The lead lawyer for West Ridge rose smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. Richard Trent representing West Ridge Development. The defendant's property is in clear violation of City Code 452B, which prohibits residential buildings from being used for commercial purposes in that zone." Judge Preston nodded. "And the defense?" Lynn stood, willing her legs not to shake. "Lin Chen, Your Honor, representing Mr. Fengjiang." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And you are a member of the bar, Ms. Chen?" There was a subtle emphasis on Ms. that made Lynn's spine stiffen. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been licensed for 8 years. The judge made a note. "Not often we see solo practitioners in matters like this. Proceed," Lin cleared her throat. Your Honor, we are prepared to demonstrate that Mr. Zhang's property is not in violation of Code 452B. The code specifically refers to active commercial enterprises, and Mr. Zhang's occasional sale of vegetables from his garden does not constitute— Ms. Chen, the judge interrupted. Are you familiar with the filing procedures of this court? Lin paused, confused. I believe so, Your Honor. Then perhaps you can explain why your motion to dismiss wasn't filed with the proper cover sheet, or why your exhibits aren't labeled according to court guidelines. Lin felt her face growing hot. She had followed the procedures outlined on the court website, but now uncertainty crept in. I apologize, Your Honor. If there's been an error— There's been several, Judge Preston said dryly. But we'll proceed anyway. I wouldn't want to delay the court's business over inexperience. There was a ripple of laughter from the West Ridge table. Lin saw Mr. Trent lean over to whisper something to his colleague, both of them smirking in her direction. For the next 20 minutes, Lin tried to present their case, but Judge Preston interrupted her repeatedly with procedural questions and corrections. Each time she had to stop and apologize, she could feel her credibility crumbling. Your Honor, she said, trying to get back on track, if I could just direct your attention to the historical use clause in the city charter. Ms. Chen, the judge sighed loudly, are you actually suggesting I'm not familiar with the city charter? No, Your Honor, of course not. I just wanted to highlight— What you're highlighting is your own inexperience, he said sharply. This court doesn't have time for amateur hour. Do you even have any experience with property law? Lin stood straighter. I've handled several tenant-landlord disputes and— The judge actually laughed. Tenant disputes. I see. He turned to Mr. Trent. Counselor, your response to Ms. Chen's argument? Mr. Trent rose with a confident smile. Your Honor, while I appreciate Ms. Chen's enthusiasm, the law is quite clear. Mr. Zhang has been selling produce from his property for years, as evidenced by these photos our investigators took. He held up several glossy pictures. That constitutes commercial activity in a residential zone. But it's just a small garden, Lin objected. He gives away most of what he grows to neighbors. The few dollars he makes from occasional sales couldn't— Possibly. Ms. Chen, Judge Preston cut in. Are you addressing the court or arguing with opposing counsel? Because neither approach is working for you. More laughter rippled through the courtroom. Lin felt as though the floor was tilting beneath her feet. She glanced at Mr. Zhang, who was staring down at his hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Your Honor, she tried again. The spirit of the law— The spirit? Judge Preston raised his eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. We deal with the letter of the law in this courtroom, Ms. Chen. Perhaps that's something they didn't cover in your educational background. The way he said it made it clear what he thought of her night school degree. Lin felt a flash of anger, cut through her embarrassment. My education is fully accredited, Your Honor, and I am a licensed attorney with the right to represent my client in this court. The courtroom fell silent at her firm tone. Judge Preston's eyes narrowed. Very well, he said coldly. Then represent him. But do so according to the rules and procedures of this court, or I'll have to consider sanctions for wasting the court's time. The rest of the hearing was a blur of humiliation. Every point Lin tried to make was dismissed or ridiculed. When she attempted to enter Mr. Zhang's property records into evidence, Judge Preston found fault with her documentation. When she cited a similar case that had been decided in favor of the property owner, the judge claimed the circumstances were entirely different. All the while, the West Ridge lawyers exchanged knowing glances, barely hiding their amusement at her struggle. Finally, Judge Preston held up his hand. I've heard enough. It's clear that Mr. Zhang's property is in violation of Code 452B. He has 30 days to cease all commercial activity or face fines of $1,000 per day. But, Your Honor, Lin protested, that effectively forces him to sell. He can't afford those fines, and West Ridge knows it. They're using this technicality to force out longtime residents so they can build luxury condos. Ms. Chen, Judge Preston's voice cracked like a whip. That's enough. This court deals with law, not conspiracy theories about developers. You're lucky I'm not citing you for contempt." He banged his gavel. Case dismissed. As people began to file out, Judge Preston added, "Oh, and Ms. Chen? Next time you decide to venture into a real courtroom, I suggest you learn the basics first. The janitor's entrance is in the back, should you ever feel compelled to return." The Westridge lawyers didn't even try to hide their laughter now. Lynn stood frozen, her face burning with humiliation as the judge swept out through the side door. Mr. Zhang touched her arm gently. "You tried your best," he said quietly. "Thank you for that." Lynn gathered her papers with shaking hands, unable to look him in the eye. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have been better prepared. I should have—" "No." Mr. Zhang shook his head. "You were the only one who tried to help. Those others," he nodded toward the departing Westridge lawyers, "they have all the power, all the connections." Lynn watched them leave, laughing and congratulating each other on their easy victory. Mr. Trent caught her eye and gave her a mocking little bow before disappearing through the doors. Outside on the courthouse steps, Lynn helped Mr. Zhang down to the street level. The morning sun had given way to clouds and a light rain began to fall. "What will you do now?" she asked him. He shrugged, his thin shoulders moving under his old shirt. "What can I do? I will sell. My home of 30 years. His voice trailed. Lynn felt something harden inside her. The shame and humiliation were still there, but beneath them something else was taking root. Determination. "This isn't over," she said quietly, more to herself than to Mr. Zhang. "I made mistakes today, but I won't make them again." As they walked away from the courthouse, Lynn made a silent vow. She would learn from this defeat. She would master every procedure, every rule, every unwritten code of the legal world that had been used against her today. And someday she would return to that courtroom. Not as the woman they had laughed at, but as someone they could no longer ignore. The bus ride home from the courthouse felt longer than usual. Lynn sat with her briefcase clutched to her chest, replaying every moment of the hearing in her mind. Each remembered snicker, every dismissive glance from Judge Preston cut into her like tiny knives. She had failed Mr. Zhang, failed herself when the bus reached her stop. Lynn thanked the driver, a habit her parents had instilled in her, and walked the 3 blocks to her apartment building. The rain had picked up, but she barely noticed as droplets soaked through her jacket. The weight of defeat was far heavier than wet clothes. Her daughter May was already home when Lynn opened the door to their small 2-bedroom apartment. At 17, May was everything Lynn had worked for, bright, confident, already accepted to 3 universities with scholarships. She looked up from her textbooks spread across their kitchen table. "Mom, you're soaked." "What happened?" May jumped up, grabbing a towel from the bathroom. "How was court?" Lynn tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. "Not good," she admitted, taking the towel. "The judge, he didn't even give us a chance." May's face darkened. "Because you're not some fancy lawyer from a big firm?" "Something like that." Lynn hung up her wet jacket. "It doesn't matter. I'll figure something else out for Mr. Zhang." "It does matter," May insisted. "You worked so hard on this case. You know the law better than—" "Knowing isn't always enough," Lynn cut in gently. "There are rules I didn't know, ways of doing things that nobody taught me." May watched as her mother carefully unpacked her briefcase, laying out the damp papers to dry. "So what now?" Lynn paused, her hand resting on a law book. The humiliation of the morning still burned, but underneath was a slow, steady flame of something else. Not anger exactly. Purpose. "Now," she said slowly, "I learned the rules. All of them." That night after May had gone to bed, Lynn opened her laptop. She still had access to the law school's online library through an alumni account. For years, she had focused only on the areas of law that affected her community: tenant rights, immigration, small business regulations. Now she began to search for something different. She typed, "Court Procedures, Federal District Court." Then, unwritten rules, courtroom etiquette, and finally, how to challenge judicial bias. By morning, Lynn had filled a notebook with notes and printed dozens of pages of guidelines, articles, and case studies. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but her mind felt clearer than it had in years. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Lynn would handle her regular cases during the day, mostly helping neighbors with landlord disputes or small claims issues. But her nights belonged to her secret project. She created a new email address under the name L. Way and began corresponding with law professors at various universities, asking carefully worded questions about complex procedural matters. She joined online forums where judges and attorneys discussed the finer points of courtroom strategy, always observing, learning, but never revealing too much about herself. One evening, as Lynn was reviewing a particularly complex article on appellate procedure, her phone rang. It was Mr. Jang. "I signed the papers today," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Westridge gave me 30 days to move out." Lynn closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her failure again. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jang. I should have done better." No, he insisted. "You tried. That's more than anyone else did." He paused. "They're paying me for the house. Not what it's worth, but enough that I can find a small apartment." After they hung up, Lynn sat motionless at her table. The development company had won, just as they always did against people without power or connections. Just as they always would unless someone changed the rules of the game. The next day, Lynn did something she had never done before. She called in sick to the small legal aid office where she worked part-time. Instead of going to work, she took a bus downtown and walked into the county law library. "Can I help you?" asked the librarian, looking surprised to see someone in Lynn's simple clothes in this cathedral of legal knowledge. "Yes," Lynn said with quiet confidence. "I need everything you have on judicial appointments and qualifications for the federal bench." The librarian raised an eyebrow but directed Lynn to the appropriate section. For hours, Lynn read about the process, by which judges were selected, the qualifications required, the political considerations involved. It was a world far removed from hers, but as she read, an idea began to take shape. That night, Lynn opened a new document on her laptop and began to type. The article flowed from her fingers as if it had been waiting to be written. A careful, measured criticism of how procedural rules often advantaged wealthy litigants and created barriers for others. She cited cases, statistics, and legal precedents with precision. When she finished, it was nearly dawn. Lynn read over what she had written. It was good, better than good. It was the kind of legal analysis she had always been capable of, but had never had the confidence to share. She saved the file, then created a new email account under the name E.M. Richards, her mother's maiden name combined with her father's initial. After a moment's hesitation, she sent the article to a respected legal journal with a brief cover note identifying herself as a practicing attorney with a focus on access to justice issues. 3 weeks later, Lynn received a response. The journal wanted to publish her article. "Mom, I'm going to be late for study group," May called from the front door, pulling Lynn back to the present moment. "Sorry, coming." Lynn grabbed her keys, trying to hide her excitement. She couldn't tell May about the article yet. It felt too fragile, too new. As the months passed, Lynn continued her double life. By day, she was still the simple lawyer helping her neighbors with routine legal matters, often working for free or for very little. But by night, she was E.M. Richards, whose insightful legal analyses were beginning to attract attention in academic circles. Her second article, a discussion of bias in courtroom procedures, was quoted in a law review. Her third, examining the impact of judge-made rules on self-represented litigants, earned an invitation to submit to an even more prestigious journal. Lynn created careful barriers between her two identities. E.M. Richards had a P.O. box for correspondence and declined all invitations to speak at conferences or events. "Due to personal circumstances, I am unable to appear publicly at this time," she would write when asked. Strangely, this air of mystery only seemed to increase interest in her work. 1 year after the humiliating day in Judge Preston's courtroom, Lynn received an email that made her heart race. The Judicial Nominating Commission for the Federal District was seeking applications for new judges. The current administration had pledged to increase diversity on the bench, looking particularly for candidates with non-traditional backgrounds and demonstrated commitment to equal justice. Lynn stared at her computer screen for a long time. The idea that had begun as a distant dream now seemed to shimmer with possibility. But could she really do it? Apply to become a federal judge? The qualifications were clear: U.S. citizenship, residence in the district, membership in good standing. With the bar and at least 10 years of legal experience, Lynn checked all those boxes. But there were unofficial requirements too: connections, prestige, the right kind of experience. She thought about Judge Preston's smirking face, about Mr. Jang having to leave his home of 30 years, about all the others like him who never got a fair chance in courtrooms where the rules were stacked against them. Taking a deep breath, Lynn opened a new document and began to type her application. In it, she detailed her years of service to low-income clients, her perfect ethical record, and, this was the risk, her identity as E.M. Richards, now the author of 7 widely cited articles on judicial reform and access to justice. "This is crazy," she whispered to herself as she uploaded the application to the commission's website. "They'll never pick someone like me." But 2 weeks later, Lynn received a phone call that left her shaking. The commission wanted to interview her. "Ms. Chen," said the woman on the phone, "we were particularly interested in your published work. E.M. Richards's articles have been quite influential in recent discussions about court reform." Lynn gripped the phone tightly. "Thank you. Those issues are very important to me." "We can see that. Your application is unusual, but these are unusual times." The woman paused. "The interview will be next Thursday at 2 p.m. The commission members will have questions about your experience, your judicial philosophy, and your vision for the court." After hanging up, Lynn sat down hard on her couch. This was really happening. She had a chance, small perhaps but real, to enter the very system that had once humiliated her. Not to seek revenge, but to change things from within. That evening, when May came home from her after-school job, Lynn was waiting with a homemade cake, something she hadn't had time to make in years. "What's the occasion?" May asked, dropping her backpack by the door. Lynn took a deep breath. "I have something to tell you, something big." As Lynn explained about her secret writing career and the judicial application, May's eyes grew wider and wider. "You're E.M. Richards? The one my constitutional law professor is always quoting?" May shook her head in disbelief. "Mom, that's amazing." "But why did you keep it secret?" Lynn smiled slightly. "I needed to see if my ideas could stand on their own, without people judging them based on who I am or where I come from." May came around the table and hugged her mother tightly. "They're going to pick you. They'd be crazy not to." Lynn returned the hug, feeling a mix of hope and terror. "It's a long shot, honey. There will be many qualified applicants with better connections, but none with better reasons to want justice," May said firmly. The next morning, Lynn rode the bus downtown, again, but this time she didn't stop at the legal aid office. Instead, she walked to a small clothing store she had passed many times but never entered. The sign in the window read, "Professional Attire." A bell jingled as she pushed open the door. The saleswoman looked up with a practiced smile. "Can I help?" "You?" Lynn straightened her shoulders. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I need something to wear to a very important interview, something that says I belong there." As the woman began to show her options, Lynn felt the weight of her 2 lives, the struggling neighborhood lawyer and the respected legal scholar, beginning to merge into something new. Whatever happened with the judicial nomination, she had already crossed an invisible line. She had stopped believing what Judge Preston and people like him thought of her, and that perhaps was the most important step of all. The interview room was larger than Lynn had expected, with a long wooden table where 7 people sat watching her enter. 6 men, 1 woman, all in expensive suits, all with the polished look of people who had never worried about bus fare or second-hand clothes. Lynn adjusted the collar of her new navy blue suit, the most expensive piece of clothing she had ever owned. The saleswoman had helped her choose something professional but not flashy. "You want them to focus on what you say, not what you wear," she had advised. Ms. Chen, the woman at the center of the table, said, rising slightly. "I'm Patricia Winters, chair of the Judicial Selection Committee. Please have a seat." Lynn nodded and sat down, placing her portfolio on the table in front of her. She had practiced this moment 100 times in her small apartment, with May playing the role of the committee members, asking tough questions while Lynn worked on keeping her voice steady and her answers clear. "We've reviewed your application materials," Patricia continued. "I must say they present an unusual candidate." A gray-haired man to Patricia's right cleared his throat. "What Ms. Winters means is that we don't often see applicants from your background. Most of our candidates come from major law firms or the prosecutor's office." Lynn met his eyes directly. "I understand that, sir, but with respect, perhaps that's exactly why the bench lacks the diversity of perspective that the public deserves." She saw a few eyebrows raise. Good. She needed to establish from the start that she wouldn't be intimidated. For the next hour, the questions came rapid fire. About her education? Yes, I attended night school while working full-time and raising my daughter. Her experience? I've handled over 500 cases, primarily serving clients who couldn't afford traditional representation. And her writings? As E.M. Richards, I chose a pen name because I wanted my ideas to be judged on their merits, not dismissed because of who I am. The most difficult moment came when a stern-looking man at the end of the table leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, your application mentions that you appeared before Judge Preston last year in a zoning case. The ruling went against your client. Do you feel that was due to bias?" Lynn felt her heart rate spike. This was dangerous territory. Criticizing a sitting judge could end her chances immediately. But lying would be worse. "What I experienced in Judge Preston's courtroom," she said carefully, "was a reminder of how intimidating our legal system can be for ordinary people and those who represent them. The procedural complexities that seem routine to insiders can become barriers to justice for others." She paused. "That experience shaped my commitment to judicial reform, as reflected in my articles." The committee members exchanged glances. Lynn couldn't read their expressions. "One last question," Patricia said. "Why do you want this position? Being a federal judge is demanding work with tremendous responsibility." Lynn took a deep breath. This was the question she had prepared for most carefully. "I've spent my career working with people who feel the legal system wasn't built for them," she began. "People who believe, often correctly, that the deck is stacked against them before they ever walk into a courtroom. I want to be the kind of judge who changes that perception, not by favoring the underdog, but by ensuring that everyone, regardless of their resources or background, has a truly fair hearing." She looked around the table. Justice shouldn't depend on having the most expensive lawyer or knowing the unwritten rules of the courthouse. When the interview ended, Lynn thanked the committee and walked out on legs that felt like water. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. She had done her best. Now all she could do was wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Days stretched into weeks. Lynn continued her regular work, but each time her phone rang, her heart jumped. May checked in constantly, sometimes texting just to ask, "Any news?" with a row of anxious face emojis. After 6 weeks of silence, Lynn had almost convinced herself she hadn't been selected when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Chen?" a crisp voice said when she answered. "This is Senator Wilson's office. The senator would like to meet with you regarding your judicial application. Are you available tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Lynn nearly dropped the phone. Senator Wilson was the senior senator for their state. His approval would be necessary for her nomination to move forward. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, I can be there." The senator's office was in a gleaming downtown building that Lynn had passed many times but never entered. His chief of staff, a young woman with a friendly smile, led her to a comfortable meeting room. "The senator will be with you shortly," she said. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "Water would be nice, thank you," Lynn said, trying to keep her voice steady. Senator Wilson was a tall man with silver hair and a politician's practiced smile. But as he shook Lynn's hand, his eyes were thoughtful, assessing. "Ms. Chen," he said, sitting across from her. "Or should I say, E.M. Richards. Your articles have made quite an impression in legal circles." "Thank you, Senator," he nodded. "I'll be direct. Your name has been forwarded to the White House as one of 3 finalists for the federal judgeship. Before I decide whether to support your nomination, I wanted to meet you myself." Lynn's pulse quickened. One of 3 finalists. She had gotten further than she'd ever dreamed possible. "I appreciate that, Senator. This is unusual, you understand," he continued. "You don't have the typical background for a federal judge. No big firm experience, no political connections." He smiled slightly. "Though your alter ego has certainly made waves." "May I ask who the other finalists are?" Lynn ventured. "I can't share that information," the senator said. "But I can tell you they have more conventional resumes. The committee was quite divided over your application." For the next half hour they discussed Lynn's background, her judicial philosophy, and her views on various legal issues. Senator Wilson was well informed and asked probing questions that tested the depth of her knowledge. Finally, he sat back. "One last question, Ms. Chen. If appointed, how would you handle cases involving powerful interests, big corporations, wealthy individuals, or even the government itself?" Lynn didn't hesitate. "The same way I would handle any case, Senator. By applying the law fairly, ensuring that all parties have a genuine opportunity to be heard, and making decisions based on legal principles rather than who the parties are." The senator studied her for a long moment. "You know, I've asked that question to dozens of judicial candidates over the years. Most give long, complicated answers full of qualifications and legal jargon." He smiled. "Yours might be the most straightforward response I've heard." As Lynn left the senator's office, she felt a strange mixture of hope and resignation. She had done everything she could. The rest was out of her hands. 2 days later, Lynn was helping an elderly couple review a lease agreement when her phone buzzed with a text from May. "Mom, call me right now." Lynn excused herself and stepped into the hallway to call her daughter. "Mom." May's voice was so excited that Lynn could barely understand her. "The White House just called our apartment. They're trying to reach you. They wouldn't tell me what it's about, but they said it's urgent." Lynn's hands began to shake. "Did they leave a number?" "Yes, I wrote it down exactly like they said." May read off the number, and Lynn carefully entered it into her phone. "I'll call you back," she promised May, then took a deep breath and dialed. The next hour passed in a blur. The call from the White House counsel's office. The congratulations. The explanation of next steps. Background checks, financial disclosures, the formal nomination announcement. "The president was particularly impressed by your articles on judicial access," the White House lawyer told her. "And Senator Wilson gave you a strong endorsement." When the call ended, Lynn stood motionless in the hallway of the small community center where she had been meeting with clients. She was going to be a federal judge, the same court where she had been humiliated just 15 months ago. Lynn finished her meeting with the elderly couple, carefully explaining each clause of their lease as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But when she left the building, she found herself walking toward the bus stop with lighter steps than she had in years. On impulse, she took a detour, walking several blocks until she stood in front of the grand courthouse. Soon she would walk through those doors not as an outsider, but as Judge Lynn Chen. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. That evening, Lynn and May celebrated with a special dinner at their small kitchen table. May had insisted on cooking, filling their apartment with the familiar smells of the dumplings Lynn's mother had taught her to make. "I still can't believe it," May said, placing a steaming plate in front of Lynn. "My mom, the federal judge." Lynn smiled. "It's not final yet. The Senate still has to confirm me." "They will," May said with absolute confidence. "And then you'll show all those fancy lawyers what real justice looks like." Lynn's smile faded slightly. It's not about showing anyone anything, May. It's about doing the job fairly. May sat down across from her mother. I know, but don't pretend you're not thinking about Judge Preston's face when he realizes who you are. Lynn had been thinking about exactly that, more than she wanted to admit. If I'm confirmed, I'll need to work with all the other judges, including Judge Preston. This can't be personal. But it is personal, May insisted. Everything about the law is personal to the people whose lives it affects. That's what makes you different. You know that. Lynn considered her daughter's words as they ate. May was right in a way. The law was personal. It had been personal when she watched her elderly neighbor lose his home. It had been personal when Judge Preston dismissed her based on her appearance and background. But as a judge, she would need to find the balance between remembering the human impact of legal decisions and applying the law impartially. The coming months would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The background checks were invasive, the financial disclosures complicated for someone with her modest means. The Senate confirmation hearings would be grueling, and beyond all that lay the real challenge, proving that she belonged on the bench, not just to others but to herself. Lynn looked around their small apartment, at the worn furniture, the books stacked on every surface, the kitchen table where she had studied law long after May had gone to bed. Soon this chapter of their lives would end. Whatever came next would be different in ways she could barely comprehend. Are you scared? May asked suddenly, watching her mother's face. Lynn considered lying, then decided against it. Yes, she admitted. But not too scared to do it anyway. May nodded, satisfied. That's what courage is, right? Being afraid but doing the thing anyway. Lynn reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher, May replied with a smile. Later that night, after May had gone to bed, Lynn sat at her computer and began a new document. Not an article this time, but a letter to herself. A reminder of why she had started this journey and what she hoped to accomplish. Remember where you came from, she typed. Remember who you serve. Remember that the law is powerful, but justice is fragile. She saved the letter and closed her laptop. Tomorrow would bring the first of many challenges on her new path. But for tonight she allowed herself to feel, just briefly, the satisfaction of having proven wrong everyone who had ever underestimated her. The Senate confirmation hearings were held in a wood-paneled room that smelled of polish and power. Lynn sat alone at a small table facing a semicircle of senators, their faces arranged in various expressions of curiosity, skepticism, and occasionally, open hostility. Ms. Chen, began Senator Hargrove, a silver-haired man with piercing eyes. Your nomination has raised some eyebrows in the legal community. Can you explain to this committee why someone with your limited experience should be confirmed to the federal bench? Lynn had anticipated this question. Her preparation folder contained dozens of potential challenges to her qualifications, with carefully crafted responses for each. Senator, she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. I believe my experience offers a perspective that is currently underrepresented in our federal courts. I've handled over 500 cases serving clients who often face significant barriers to justice. This hands-on work has given me insights into how our legal system functions, or sometimes fails to function, for ordinary Americans. She paused, taking a sip of water. Additionally, my published work as E.M. Richards has contributed meaningfully to legal scholarship on access to justice and procedural fairness, topics that are central to maintaining public trust in our courts. Senator Hargrove frowned slightly. Yes, about that pen name. Don't you think there's something deceptive about hiding your identity while publishing legal opinions? Lynn met his gaze directly. I didn't choose a pen name to deceive anyone, Senator. I chose it because I wanted my ideas to be evaluated on their merits rather than dismissed because of my background or lack of prestigious affiliations. The quality of legal thinking shouldn't depend on where someone went to school or which firm they work for. A murmur ran through the room. Lynn saw Senator Wilson sitting 3 seats down from Hargrove give her a slight nod of approval. For the next 2 hours, the questions continued about her judicial philosophy, her views on precedent, her approach to constitutional interpretation. Lynn answered each one thoughtfully, drawing on her years of study and practice. She didn't have the polished delivery of candidates from big firms or the prosecutor's office, but her responses had a clarity and directness that seemed to impress even her skeptics. Near the end of the hearing, a senator who had been silent until then leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, there's something I'm curious about. In your application materials, you mention appearing before Judge William Preston last year. If confirmed, you would be serving alongside Judge Preston on the same bench. How do you feel about that?" The room grew quiet. This was dangerous territory. Any hint of personal grudge or vendetta could sink her nomination. Lynn took a deep breath. "I believe that we learn from every experience in our professional lives, Senator. My appearance in Judge Preston's courtroom taught me important lessons about the power judges hold and how their actions affect those who come before them." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "If confirmed, I would approach my relationship with Judge Preston just as I would with any colleague, with professional respect and a commitment to the shared work of administering justice fairly." "Well said," the senator replied, looking satisfied. When the hearing finally ended, Lynn gathered her notes with slightly trembling hands. Her phone buzzed with a text from May. "You're all over social media. People are sharing clips of your answers. Judge Chen is trending." Lynn smiled, tucking her phone away. The hardest part was over. Now she just had to wait for the committee's vote. 3 weeks later, Lynn received the news she had been waiting for. The Senate had confirmed her nomination by a vote of 58-42. She would be sworn in as a federal judge the following month. The reality of it hit her as she stood in the small bedroom of their apartment, packing boxes. They would be moving to a new place, nothing extravagant but closer to the courthouse and with an extra room that could serve as a home office. May had already left for college, but she would have a proper bedroom when she came home for holidays. Lynn carefully wrapped a framed photo of her parents in tissue paper. What would they think of their daughter now? Her father, who had worked 16-hour days in their small grocery store, who had insisted she learn English perfectly while keeping her Chinese heritage. Her mother, who had sewn Lynn's clothes by hand to save money for books. "You would be proud," she whispered to the photo. "I hope you would be proud." The day before her swearing-in ceremony, Lynn received an unexpected email from the chief judge of the district. "Judge Chen, due to ongoing renovations in the courthouse, we've had to reassign several courtrooms. When you begin next week, you'll be presiding in courtroom 7. I hope this won't be an inconvenience. Regards, Chief Judge Morales." Lynn stared at the screen, her heart racing. Courtroom 7. The very room where Judge Preston had humiliated her just 18 months ago. Was this a coincidence? Or had someone on the court remembered her mention of that case during the confirmation process? Either way, it felt like the closing of a circle, a chance to transform a place of shame into something else entirely. The morning of her swearing-in was bright and clear. Lynn wore a new suit, charcoal gray, conservative but well-tailored. May had flown home from college for the occasion, and together they took a car to the courthouse. "Nervous?" May asked, watching her mother check her appearance one last time, in the car's mirror. "A little," Lynn admitted. "It's a big responsibility." "You've earned it," May said firmly. "And you're going to be amazing." The ceremony itself was brief but moving. Lynn raised her right hand and swore to administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. As she spoke the words, she felt their weight settle on her shoulders, not as a burden but as a purpose. Afterward, there was a small reception in the courthouse atrium. Most of the other judges attended, offering congratulations with varying degrees of warmth. Lynn scanned the room looking for one face in particular, but Judge Preston was nowhere to be seen. "He's out of town at a conference," a voice said behind her, as if reading her thoughts. Lynn turned to find Chief Judge Morales, a tall woman with kind eyes. Judge Preston, I mean. He'll be back next week. I wasn't, Lynn began, then stopped herself. Thank you for letting me know. Judge Morales smiled slightly. Courtroom 7 was his for many years, you know. Some might say he considered it his territory. So, it hadn't been a coincidence. The chief judge knew exactly what she was doing with that assignment. I'll try to be worthy of it, Lynn said carefully. I'm sure you will. Judge Morales touched her arm gently. This court needs fresh perspectives, Judge Chen. That's why I supported your nomination. The following Monday, Lynn arrived at the courthouse early. She entered through the judge's private entrance, still not quite believing she had the key card that granted her access. A security guard nodded respectfully as she passed. Good morning, Judge Chen. Her chambers were located just behind courtroom 7, a spacious office with tall windows and built-in bookshelves. Her law books had already been unpacked and arranged by her new clerk, a bright young woman from the State University Law School. Good morning, Judge, the clerk said, handing Lynn a folder. These are the cases on today's docket. The first hearing is at 9:30. Lynn thanked her and sat down at the desk, her desk now, to review the files. There were 3 cases scheduled: a motion to dismiss in a contract dispute, a sentencing hearing in a nonviolent drug offense, and a status conference in a civil rights case. At 9:25, there was a knock on her door. It's time, Your Honor, her clerk said. Lynn stood and put on the black robe that hung on a hook by the door. The material was heavier than she had expected, the sleeves falling perfectly to her wrists. She took a moment to center herself, remembering the letter she had written months ago. Remember where you came from, remember who you serve. Then she followed her clerk through the private door that led directly to the bench in courtroom 7. All rise, the bailiff called as she entered. The United States District Court for the Eastern District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Lin Chen presiding. The courtroom looked different from this perspective, larger and somehow smaller at the same time. The bench where she now stood seemed miles high compared to the tables where the attorneys sat. Lynn could see how easy it would be, from this position, to forget what it felt like to be on the other side. Please be seated, she said, her voice clear and confident. Good morning, everyone. As the attorneys and litigants settled into their seats, Lynn noticed something unexpected. Sitting in the back row of the courtroom was a familiar face, Mr. Zhang, her former client who had lost his home to the developers. He smiled shyly when their eyes met, giving her a small nod of encouragement. Lynn felt a surge of emotion but kept her expression neutral. This was exactly why she had wanted this position, not for power or prestige, but for the chance to make the legal system work fairly for people like Mr. Zhang. We'll begin with case number 2024 CV-156, Westland Manufacturing versus Brooks Supplies, she announced, opening the first file. The attorneys approached the podium, one from a large firm, wearing an expensive suit with gleaming cufflinks, the other a younger lawyer with a slightly rumpled appearance and a worn briefcase that reminded Lynn painfully of her own, just 2 years ago. Your Honor, the expensive suit began, we've filed a motion to dismiss based on the statute of limitations. The plaintiff clearly failed to file within the required period and— I've reviewed your motion, counsel, Lynn interrupted gently. But before you continue, I have some questions for both sides. What followed was a thorough examination of the issues that surprised both attorneys. Lynn asked about details buried deep in the exhibits, cited relevant precedents that neither had mentioned in their briefs, and probed the potential impact of a recent state Supreme Court decision. By the time she called a 15-minute recess to consider her ruling, the younger attorney was looking at her with undisguised admiration, while the expensive suit seemed unsettled. In her chambers, Lynn reviewed her notes once more. The motion to dismiss was technically correct on the statute of limitations, but there were equitable considerations that the defense hadn't addressed. The small company that was being sued had tried to resolve the issue multiple times before litigation, only to be stonewalled by the larger corporation. When court resumed, Lynn delivered her ruling. While I recognize the importance of statutes of limitations in providing certainty to litigants, the law also recognizes that strict application can sometimes produce unjust results. In this case, The doctrine of equitable tolling applies due to the defendant's documented refusal to engage in good faith discussions despite the plaintiff's repeated attempts. The motion to dismiss is therefore denied. This matter will proceed to discovery. The younger lawyer barely contained his smile, while the expensive suit looked stunned. Lynn moved on to the next case without allowing either reaction to affect her. The morning proceeded smoothly. For the sentencing hearing, Lynn carefully explained her reasoning to the defendant directly, speaking not just to the lawyers, but to the human being whose life would be affected by her decision. For the civil rights case, she set a clear schedule that would move the litigation forward without unnecessary delays. When the lunch recess was called, Lynn returned to her chambers and closed the door. Only then did she allow herself a moment to absorb what had just happened. She had presided over her first session as a federal judge in the very courtroom where she had once been humiliated. There was a soft knock at the door. "Judge Chen?" her clerk called. "There's someone here who would like to speak with you. Mr. Zhang?" Lynn hesitated. Judges had to be careful about ex parte communications, especially with former clients. But Mr. Zhang wasn't involved in any pending cases. "He can come in," she decided. Mr. Zhang entered hesitantly, clutching a small plant in a ceramic pot. "Judge Chen," he said, bowing slightly. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Zhang, it's good to see you." He placed the plant on her desk. "A small gift for your new office. It is a Chinese money plant, for good fortune." He smiled. "Though I think you have made your own good fortune." "Thank you," Linny said, touched by the gesture. "How are you doing? Have you found a new place to live?" Mr. Zhang nodded. "A small apartment. Not like my house, but it is okay." He paused. "I came today to see you in the judge's chair, to see that sometimes things can change for the better." Lynn felt a lump in her throat. "I hope they can. I'll certainly try to make them better." After Mr. Zhang left, Lynn stood by the window of her chambers, looking out at the city below. Her first day wasn't over yet. The afternoon would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to either uphold or change the system from within. And somewhere in this very building, Judge Preston was about to learn that the woman he had once dismissed would now be his colleague on the bench. Lynn smiled slightly at the thought, then turned back to her desk. She had work to do. Lynn had been a judge for exactly 1 week when the moment she had both anticipated and dreaded finally arrived. She was reviewing case files in her chambers when her clerk knocked on the door. "Judge Chen? The calendar for next week just came in. You have a major corporate litigation case on Monday morning." The young woman hesitated. "And Judge Preston is representing one of the parties." Lynn looked up, her pen pausing mid-note. "Judge Preston? Don't you mean former Judge Preston?" Her clerk nodded. "Yes, sorry. He stepped down from the bench about 6 months ago to return to private practice. Apparently he's now a partner at Harrington & Weil, representing mostly corporate clients." Lynn set down her pen carefully. So the moment of reckoning would come sooner than she had expected. William Preston would be appearing in her courtroom. Courtroom, for once his domain as an attorney, and she would be the judge. "Thank you," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Please send me the case file so I can prepare." Over the weekend, Lynn studied the case thoroughly. West Ridge Development, the very same company that had forced Mr. Zhang from his home, was suing a community organization that had been protesting their latest project. The complaint alleged defamation, interference with business relationships, and various other claims clearly designed to silence opposition. William Preston was listed as lead counsel for West Ridge. Lynn felt a familiar anger rising as she read through the pleadings, but she pushed it down. Her personal feelings about West Ridge or Preston couldn't matter. What mattered was the law, applied fairly. By Sunday night, she had formed her preliminary opinions on the legal issues, identified the key precedents, and prepared questions for both sides. She was ready, or as ready as she could be. Monday morning arrived with a light rain that tapped against the windows of Lynn's chambers as she reviewed her notes one final time. At 9:25, she put on her robe and took a deep breath. "Remember who you serve," she whispered to herself. As she entered the courtroom, the bailiff's call of "All rise" brought everyone to their feet. Lynn took her place at the bench, looking out over the assembled attorneys and spectators with a calm she didn't entirely feel. And there he was. William Preston stood at the plaintiff's table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit impeccable as always. Next to him were two junior attorneys and a man Lynn recognized as the CEO of Westridge Development. At the defense table sat a single attorney, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a determined expression, alongside three people who appeared to be community organizers, their clothes simple but neat. "Be seated," Lynn said, and everyone complied. "Good morning. We're here today for Westridge Development versus Eastside Community Coalition, case number 2025 CV289. Let's begin with the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction." Preston rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, and then paused as he looked up at Lynn for the first time. Lynn saw the exact moment recognition dawned in his eyes, the slight widening, the momentary shock quickly controlled. To his credit, Preston recovered, quickly, clearing his throat and continuing. "Your Honor, Westridge Development seeks immediate relief from the defendant's ongoing campaign of harassment and defamation, which is causing irreparable harm to my client's business interests and reputation." As Preston outlined his arguments, Lynn listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. If her questions were more probing than Preston might have expected, he didn't show it, responding with the skill of a seasoned litigator. When the defense attorney rose to present her counter-arguments, Lynn gave her the same careful attention, asking equally challenging questions about the community group's activities and the legal boundaries of protected speech versus defamation. By lunchtime, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Judge Chen was exceptionally well prepared and would not be an easy judge for either side to persuade through anything less than solid legal reasoning. "We'll break for lunch and resume at 1:30, Lynn announced. "I expect to rule on the preliminary injunction motion by the end of the day." Back in her chambers, Lynn ate the simple lunch she had brought from home while reviewing her notes. She was proud of how she'd handled the morning session. She had been fair, thorough, and professional. Preston had shown no signs of recognizing her beyond that initial moment of surprise, and she had treated him exactly as she would any other attorney. When court resumed, Lynn heard expert testimony about the economic impact of the community protests on Westridge's development project. The afternoon proceeded smoothly until a tense exchange between Preston and the defense attorney prompted Lynn to intervene. "Counsel, please direct your comments to the bench, not to each other," she said firmly. "And Mr. Preston, while I appreciate zealous advocacy, your tone toward opposing counsel is unnecessarily combative. Please adjust accordingly." Preston's face flushed slightly, the first crack in his polished demeanor. "My apologies, Your Honor," he said, his voice tight. By 4 o'clock, all arguments had been presented. Lynn took a brief recess to organize her thoughts, then returned to deliver her ruling. "After careful consideration of the evidence and arguments presented, I am denying the motion for a preliminary injunction," she began, then proceeded to explain her reasoning in detail. The community group's activities fell within protected speech under the First Amendment, and Westridge had failed to demonstrate irreparable harm that couldn't be addressed through other remedies if they ultimately prevailed at trial. "Furthermore," Lynn continued, "I am ordering both parties to participate in mediation before we proceed further with this litigation. It appears to the court that there may be room for compromise that would better serve both sides than continued conflict." As she finished speaking, Lynn glanced at Preston. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders was evident. The CEO beside him was whispering angrily in his ear. "Court is adjourned until next month's status conference, by which time I expect a report from the mediator." Lynn gathered her papers. "Counsel, please remain for a moment to discuss scheduling the mediation." As the spectators filed out, Lynn spoke briefly with both attorneys about mediator options and timing. Preston was coolly professional, avoiding direct eye contact with her as they worked out the details. When they finished, the defense attorney left quickly, but Preston lingered, organizing his papers with deliberate slowness until they were alone, except for the court reporter and bailiff. "Your Honor," he said finally, his voice low, "may I speak with you privately for a moment?" Lynn hesitated, then nodded. "You may come to my chambers briefly, Mr. Preston." In her office, Lynn remained standing, maintaining the formal distance between judge and attorney. "What can I help you with, counsel?" Preston stood stiffly just inside the door. "I wanted to say that your ruling today was thorough and well-reasoned, even if I disagree with the outcome." "Thank you," Lynn said simply. A silence stretched between them. Finally, Preston spoke again, his voice different now, less certain. "We've met before, haven't we? Before you took the bench." Lynn met his eyes directly. "Yes, Mr. Preston. I appeared before you in this very courtroom approximately 2 years ago, representing an elderly client in a zoning dispute against Westridge Development." Preston's expression shifted as the memory clicked into place. "The grocery store owner's daughter," he said slowly. "The one with the—" He gestured vaguely at his own suit, apparently referring to her once shabby appearance. "Yes," Lynn said calmly. "That was me." Another silence, heavier this time. Preston looked around her chambers, at the law books neatly arranged on the shelves, the framed judicial oath on the wall, the small Chinese money plant on her desk. "I don't recall the outcome of that case," he said finally, though his expression suggested otherwise. "My client lost his home," Lynn replied, her voice even. "Westridge Development prevailed, as they often did in your courtroom." Preston flushed. "I ruled according to the law, as did I today," Lynn said. The implication hung in the air between them. Preston opened his mouth as if to say something more, then closed it. Finally, he straightened his shoulders. "Well, Judge Chen, you've certainly come a long way since then." "It's quite a surprise." Lynn allowed herself a small smile. "Life often takes unexpected turns, Mr. Preston. I'm sure you didn't anticipate returning to practice after your time on the bench." Something flashed in his eyes, discomfort perhaps, or embarrassment. Rumors had circulated about why Preston had stepped down from the bench so abruptly, but Lynn had deliberately avoided seeking out the details. "No," he agreed. "I didn't. But here we are." "Here we are," Lynn echoed. "And now, if there's nothing else regarding the case, I have other matters to attend to." Preston nodded, moving toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "Your ruling today, it wasn't because of what happened before, between us?" Lynn looked at him steadily. "Everything I do on this bench is based on the law and the facts before me, Mr. Preston. Nothing more, nothing less. I would hope you'd extend me the same professional courtesy you'd give any other judge." Preston held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. Good afternoon." After he left, Lynn sat down at her desk, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no moment of sweet revenge or tearful apology. Just two professionals acknowledging a shared past and moving forward in their new roles. Perhaps that was better than any scenario she had imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text from May. "How was the big showdown with Judge Jerk? Did you make him cry?" Lynn smiled, typing back, "Very anticlimactic. Just two people doing their jobs. We'll call you tonight." 6 months later, Lynn sat in the judge's dining room, eating lunch with Judge Morales and 2 other colleagues. Their conversation about a recent Supreme Court decision was interrupted when William Preston entered with another attorney. The two of them engaged in intense discussion. Preston nodded politely to the judge's table as he passed. "Judge Chen, Judge Morales, Judge Littman, Judge Hernandez," he said, acknowledging each of them. "Counselor," they responded in near unison. As Preston continued to his table, Judge Littman leaned forward. "I'll never get used to seeing him on that side of the courtroom," he murmured. Preston was such a fixture on the bench. "Times change," Judge Morales said with a small smile. For the better, I think. She glanced at Lynn. Judge Chen has the highest approval rating among attorneys in our most recent bar survey. Apparently, they appreciate her thoroughness and fairness, even when she rules against them. Lynn felt a flush of pride but kept her expression modest. I'm still learning, she said. We all are, Judge Hernandez replied. Or at least we all should be. Later that afternoon, Lynn presided over a naturalization ceremony, one of her favorite judicial duties. As she looked out at the faces of the new citizens, she saw reflections of her own parents, who had come to this country with nothing but hope and determination. The oath you've taken today is similar to the one I took when I became a judge, she told them. We have all promised to uphold the same Constitution, the same ideals of justice and equality. Those aren't just words on paper. They're a commitment we make to each other, to do better each day than we did the day before. As the ceremony ended and the new citizens filed out with their families, Lynn noticed a familiar figure waiting by the courtroom door, Mr. Zhang, looking much happier than when she had last seen him. Beside him stood a young woman Lynn didn't recognize. Judge Chen, Mr. Zhang said, approaching the bench after the room had cleared. May I introduce my granddaughter? She just finished law school. The young woman stepped forward, extending her hand. It's an honor to meet you, Judge Chen. My grandfather has told me so much about you. You're the reason I decided to become a lawyer. Lynn shook her hand, momentarily speechless. She wants to help people like you did, Mr. Zhang said proudly. Before you became important. Lynn smiled at them both. I'm not so important, Mr. Zhang. I just have a different position now. The work is the same, trying to make the law work fairly for everyone. As they chatted, Lynn realized that this, not her confrontation with Preston, not the prestige of the federal bench, was the true measure of her journey. The chance to inspire others, to open doors that had once been closed, to prove that justice could be accessible to all. That evening, as Lynn left the courthouse, she paused on the steps where she had once stood clutching her worn briefcase, heart pounding with anxiety. She looked up at the imposing building, no longer intimidated by its grandeur. This was where she belonged now, not because she had become like those who had once dismissed her, but because she had remained true to herself while learning to navigate their world. She had changed the system not by force but by example. Lynn descended the steps and headed home, already thinking about tomorrow's cases. Ordinary people whose lives would be affected by her decisions, just as her life had once been shaped by another judge's casual cruelty. The difference was, she would never forget what it felt like to stand on the other side of the bench. And that, perhaps, was the most important qualification of all.